Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. This lecture is based on my recent biography of cytogeneticist Janaki Ammal. It was titled Chromosome Woman Nomad Scientist, E.K. Janaki Ammal, Her Life, 1897 to 1984. So Janaki Ammal, for those who don't still know her, was the first Indian woman to earn a doctorate in the botanical sciences. She did this in 1931 from the University of Michigan. Janaki was among those few who creatively united in their scientific practice diverse knowledge streams, including the humanities, especially anthropology. Her method was a reflection of what I would call her rhizomatic epistemology. It was fluid, adaptive, and synthetic, and aimed at inventing new ways of ordering or classifying transitional flora. In fact, she lived multiple lives as a cytogeneticist, a field biologist, a plant geographer, a paleobotanist, an evolutionary systematist, an experimental breeder, an ethnobotanist, and not least a naturalist, traveler explorer, and plant ecologist. Identities that might easily be identified with the blueprint of a border culture or of in-betweenness. It is difficult to name even one among her Indian male contemporaries. Almost all did what's called state science or royal science, who adopted such a cross and transdisciplinary methodology in their researches. Janaki was born and nurtured in the very lap of the Western Ghats. She never for a moment lost connection with it. In fact, it would loom large in her emotions and thoughts all her long life. Her work as an evolutionary biologist was intimately linked to the innumerable wanderings, collecting expeditions in this ecological zone. Janaki was willing to trade any amount of money for the freedom to wander in the forests, along the Holzwege, the forest paths, away from the beaten tracks, regimented paths, or mimetic grooves, into the thick of things to accomplish something original by way of research in cytogenetics and evolutionary biology. Her science involved making a series of local, small scale, and singular discoveries. It was not about making a seminal discovery or two. It was slow and it progressed over a lifetime of wandering, carving out fragments of an ever-changing and many-hued evolutionary jigsaw puzzle of planetary scale. This was slow science in the making. It was unfinished and indeterminate a pursuit by definition, and which went against the very grain of state science. To Janaki, the Western Ghats, with its forests and grasslands and its original dwellers, was nothing less than a sanctuary to which the nomad scientist could retreat every time the state attempted to impose, enslave, and restrain. She disappeared herself, often in this manner, but only to emerge with new insights about the relationship between plants and man. Janaki was precocious in shining light on the fragility of the Western Ghats and spoke about the dire need to protect it much before anyone did, much before any of the names we invoke in this context today. And yet she's been overlooked by environmental historians. That Janaki Ammal was not only an ethnobiologist, but also an economic anthropologist, an ecological thinker of shining originality, is what today's lecture is all about. These dimensions found clear articulation in her papers presented at 3 landmark conferences from the mid-1950s. The first one was under the aegis of the Wenner-Gren Foundation, and the last two, were organized by the UNESCO. So in the year 1955, Janaki Ammal was 58 years old and director of the Central Botanical Laboratory of the Botanical Survey of India, Lucknow. In July that year, she was awarded a Doctor of Laws by her alma mater, the University of Michigan, for demonstrating consistently the ability to make painstaking and accurate observations and for her patient endeavors, which stood as a model, it stated, for serious and dedicated scientific workers. During this visit to America, she would be deputed by the government of India to attend a 4-week course in radioisotope or tracer atom techniques at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Tennessee. Again, it was also in 1955 that she was invited by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, New York, to participate in the landmark symposium at Princeton, New Jersey, titled Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth. It was held between the 16th and 22nd June 1955. This was the first ever international and interdisciplinary attempt to understand the impact of human activity on the environment. It was an intense brainstorming conference on man as the ecological dominant, or what we today sometimes refer to as the Anthropocene, a term only introduced in 2000, but has not received the conference, the Wenner-Gren Symposium, Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth, has not received the scholarly attention that it rightly deserves. The conference had no political agenda. Its purpose was simply to bring together the most eminent scholars in the world to assess the scope and rate of environmental change caused by human activity, evaluate the state of knowledge of human environmental impact, and identify areas that needed further study. The American cultural geographer Carl Otwin Sauer was the chairman of the symposium. The organizing committee included such figures as the American evolutionary biologist, an exact contemporary of Janaki Ammal, Edgar Anderson, and sociologist Louis Mumford. And they suggested that Janaki work on a paper around the subject of subsistence economy of India. Several of the participants in the symposium either went on to produce seminal works in environmental history or were already well-known ecological thinkers across disciplines. Participants were selected, to quote, for their qualities as individuals and hailed from America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with specializations ranging across 20 conventionally defined disciplines. As far as India was concerned, the organizing committee wanted someone who knew its land, plants, and folk intimately, and not merely about its commercial surpluses and deficiencies. Janaki fitted the requirements of the symposium perfectly. Her substantial work in the field of cytosystematics was historical, it was evolutionary, and geographical in its approach, and matched Sauer's own approach to landscape. Sauer, who studied the impact of human interventions on landscapes, was a fierce critique of environmental determinism and defined geography as a study of cultural landscapes rather than physical or natural ones. As for Janaki, she had chosen as her life's aim the study of the evolving relationship between man and plants. In Anderson's words, man and his transported landscapes. She extensively employed cytogenetics, geology, history, and anthropology to demonstrate how species traveled across space and time in the footsteps of man. Not only was Janaki the sole invitee from India to the Wenner-Gren Symposium, but she was the sole woman participant in this landmark international symposium across the world on environmental history. Janaki's paper was presented as part of the section called Retrospect. The idea was to have presentations on the first day by people like Sauer, Clarence Glacken, Fraser Darling, on what was called the overall human time or man's tenure of the earth. It was followed on the next day by a start down the corridors of time, as it was termed, with Omar Stewart, speaking on fire as the first human tool, Carl Wittfogel on hydraulic civilizations, Eston Evans on peasant life in Western Europe, Janaki on the subsistence economy in India, Pierre Guru on crops and animals, and Mumford on the natural history of urbanization. Incidentally, India's Radha Kamal Mukherjee, director of the Institute of Sociology, Ecology and Human Relations and the vice-chancellor of the Lucknow University, was asked to present a background paper. What exactly this paper was about is unclear to me, as I haven't been able to access this and it hasn't been published. But he was not required to be physically present at Princeton. Rachel Carson, the marine biologist, she had not yet published her Silent Spring, which would be published in 1962, and Aldous Huxley were on the suggested list of invitees, but did not make it to the final round. Claude Lévi-Strauss had just that year published his treatise Tropique, which explored the impact of modernity on primitive cultures, would propel him as a leading thinker in structuralism and anthropology. He was surprisingly not a participant at the conference. It was with her paper on subsistence economy that Janaki would make a foray into the study of primitive or subsistence economies. The Western Ghats would now begin to assume a particularly central place in her epistemology, shaping her way of thinking ecologically. Janaki began her symposium paper, it was titled An Introduction to the Subsistence Economy of India, by describing the physical geography of the Indian subcontinent, including its geology. Incidentally, her second major at the University of Madras was geology. And from the 1950s, this would be added to her toolkit to map the evolutionary process of speciation via understanding and mapping polyploidy. Polyploidy merely means multiplication of the chromosome set, which could be done through various artificial means too, using X-rays, sometimes using the chemical called colchicine. Her paper was not just an enunciation of her biogeographical or cytogeographical ideas, but a reflection of her, what I would call, archipelagic thinking. The archipelago can be a cultural and imagined space, and not simply a physical entity located at the intersection of land and water. It was also an epistemological concept that allowed the exploration of connections and similitudes on a global scale, and involved creative interdisciplinary exchanges. Fundamentally demanded getting out of disciplinary silos of thinking and thinking beyond national boundaries. In Janaki's case, the focus was on flowering plants. Plants, many of which were world travelers, not unlike herself. Peninsular India, Janaki observed, was geologically very old and was a piece of the ancient continent of Gondwana, which split up to form the continents of Australia, South America, and Africa. This breakup had occurred after flowering plants had evolved on the earth, for which reason she stated Indian flora had several genera in common with Africa and South America, and to a more conservative extent, Australia. She further observed that India became part of Asia, resulting in the Himalayan uplift, and that, like Arabia, it was an annexation to Asia. The evolution of man was very closely linked with this annexation, she noted. To quote her, the close affinity between the flora and fauna of Sindh and that of Africa and Arabia, the continuation of the Sahara into India as the Great Rajputana Desert, and the movement of this desert from west to east are factors of primitive man into and within India. Are factors that have to be taken into consideration when studying the movement of primitive man into and within India. Further, the presence of temperate Himalayan plants like the viburnum and the rhododendron on isolated hill ranges in the Nilgiris of southern India was indicative of their migration during periods when the climate of southern India was more temperate, was cooler and wetter than it was today. Through her cytological investigations, Janaki had been able to confirm that these Nilgiri species of rhododendron and viburnum were identical to those of the Himalaya. The case of the wild goat, Capra hypocreus, was another case in point. It was found not only to inhabit the Nilgiri and Anai Malay ranges, but also the temperate regions of the Himalaya from Kashmir to Bhutan. After the plants, Janaki turned to the history of human evolution and migration in India, with particular focus on the genesis of tribal economies. She observed that the worldview of the primitive man, all aspects of life are harmonized into a whole, she would say, that economy in primitive societies remained a static one until it came into contact with a different culture, and that for the aborigine, every natural process is a manifestation, she would say, of magical power. resulting from certain ritual acts. Now, Janaki was making an original observation when she stated that to the tribal man, magic was a way of organizing intensive economic results. It is, she would say, his way of concentration. It is striking how close Janaki's perception was, or even prefiguring what her much younger contemporary, but most of us are familiar with Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009. That was when he was born, 1908. So Claude Lévi-Strauss stated in his Savage Mind, published 1962, this is much after the Wenner-Gren Symposium, in his chapter Science of the Concrete, in which he says, magic forms a well-articulated system. Instead of contrasting magic and science, we might compare them as two parallel modes of acquiring knowledge. Both science and magic, however, require the same sort of mental operations, Lévi-Strauss would say, and they differ not so much in kind as in the different types of phenomena to which they are applied. Diversity in mankind and cultures arose from the encounter between the old and the new, Janaki argued, by contact and fusion, analogous to how the origin of new forms of plants and animals were brought about by hybridization, resulting in new combinations of parental characters, as well as by isolation in which mutational changes may occur. Cattle keeping, for instance, evolved from hunting. A mystical connection, Janaki argued, was established between man and cattle, as was seen among the Toda of the Nilgiri Hills, whose culture was bound up with their buffalo herds. Janaki also noted that female infanticide was ordinarily practiced among the Todas because the females of the community were not of much use in tending to the herds. The inordinate reference paid to cows in India, especially on the Gangetic plain, is undoubtedly, she said, a relic of this mystic relationship of an earlier pastoral people with their herds of cattle. Cow protection, she said, she wrote in 1955, is a political issue in India. The antagonism of the Hindus to beef eaters is based chiefly on this ancient mystic link with the cow, she explained. In order to classify the different tribal economies, it was important, Janaki argued, to first discuss the types of primitive agriculture found in India. To understand, to use Nikolai Vavilov's phrase, to understand the agricultural soul of a place. Vavilov was her muse, just incidentally saying this. The earliest example of subsistence economy was that of the food gatherers. If I can have it. And these are photographs taken by Janaki Ammal herself. And you have the paniers of Wayanad who used the wooden digging stick, the tip of which was replaced later by iron. It's a similar one to the one used by the carders of the Anai Malay Hills. Here, the stick would be replaced firstly by the hoe and then the basic plow, initially operated by women. The use of oxen for plowing indicated, she observed, a synthesis of a cattle-keeping tribe with one having an agricultural economy. The ox-drawn plow was to her a great landmark in the history of agriculture and human culture equally, because it had aided food production on a much larger scale than was necessary for subsistence. When population increased, it led to conflict and disaster, with tribes fighting over food reserves. One's here reminded of Friedrich Engels' argument in his last major and unfinished 1883 work, but published in English in 1939, interestingly had a foreword written by J.B. Holden. Engels' work, The Dialectics of Nature, in which he said that human labor, including the use of tools like plows and hoes, is a key factor in shaping nature and driving its evolution. This interaction is not simply a one-way process, but a dialectical one, where humans are also changed by their interaction with nature. It is not known whether Janaki red angles. So Janaki cited the example from the Western Ghats, from her part of the Western Ghats, of the migration of the fast multiplying and aggressive Syrian Christians of Travancore and Cochin. Their migration to Malabar, to the north of present-day Kerala, to Wayanad in Malabar, which had a disastrous impact on the pioneers, altering their agricultural practice and the economy itself. She wrote, with their jungles under the plow of the new settlers, the Syrian Christians, a tribe that once was independent in its habitat had now become depressed. She also drew attention to the Kadars of Cochin, who once freely foraged honey, yam, and roots from the forest, but had now come under the care of the forest department and were paid in rice for gathering minor forest products such as these. And this had resulted in the Kadar women, according to Janaki, taking to a life of idleness and turning degenerate. Promiscuity had become a serious issue among them. Thus, the noble savage, she would say, referring, it's a nod to Rousseau's phrase, the noble savage, the idealized notion of an uncivilized human being. So the noble savage in contact with civilization, Janaki noted, generally finds himself in an awkward state. Rousseau, as we know, believed that humans were naturally good, but society with its inequalities and artificial needs corrupts them. So Janaki's discussion then geared towards agriculture in relation to climate in India, a country dictated by the monsoon cycle. Its vegetation was very much influenced by the amount and seasonal distribution of rainfall received. So she stated the vegetative climax of India is the dense and tall tropical evergreen forest found in the Western Ghats and also in Assam, the very regions Janaki had explored and botanized over the decades. The most highly evolved type of jumming or shifting cultivation is seen in Assam, Janaki noted, where a regular rotation of forest clearing takes place once every 8 years, so that sufficient time elapses for regeneration of the forest. But unfortunately, this had a negative effect. For the flora that came up after clearance were not always the same as those previously destroyed. She observed that on the field. The loss of genetic diversity associated with jumming was for Janaki an alarming issue. On the other hand, the practice of declaring parts of the forest sacred had contributed much to conserve vegetation, as people would not dare cut the trees for fear of committing sacrilege. Indeed, during the symposium, the Wenner-Gren Symposium discussion, Edgar Anderson drew attention to what Janaki's friend, Norman Loftus-Boer of the Assam Forest Service, had witnessed in the forests of Upper Burma in Assam. Anderson noted, since unrecorded time, the peoples there have had a simple nature worship. Although they had a slash and burn agriculture, that is, they burned and moved on, their hilltops were never burnt over. The hilltops were sacred, as places of worship. They were not cut over or pastured. So sacred forests or kavugal, as we say it in Kerala, were also a feature of Malabar and frequented by Janaki in search of rare botanical specimens, especially the neetum. The kavugal, she enlightened her listeners, served as sanctuaries for snakes and wildlife and often became the nuclei of sylvan temples. As man evolved from being nomadic to sedentary, he strived to attain a certain equilibrium with his environment. Best seen in Malabar, she stated, where mixed plantings followed jumming, to which she gave the name a paramba form of cultivation, kind of cultivation. In this kind of agricultural practice, the forest patch was cleared only partially, with useful trees such as the artocarpus, wild mango, that is the jack, wild mango, nutmeg, the strychnose, and cycas palm were left standing for either timber, firewood, training the pepper vine, or, in the case of cycas, even as famine food. This paramba form of cultivation, homestead cultivation, does not, she noted, did not upset the ecological balance of the natural vegetation. Even as early as 1932, Janaki had been inspired by a model farm that she saw in Malabar at Nedumbayil, which employed the Paramba form of cultivation. It employed the Poonam or shifting cultivation method. It grew multiple crops, including fruits and vegetables, alongside rice paddy. The farm's successful application of the ideas of sustainability and polycropping, though the term itself was not used, so typical of local agricultural practice, had struck her instantly as an example of how ecological balance in nature might be attained. She had thought of it as an example worth emulating and had she recommended this to her elder brother Raghavan, who is a pensioner from Burma. Also, during her expedition in Nepal in 1948-49, she had not failed to notice how the Nevari peasant worked, she said, philosophically in his fields. Janaki's symposium paper ended with a discussion on the intimate relationship between plants and man in India. The region, including India, Pakistan, and further west, the countries of Afghanistan and Iran, had been Babylonian centers of origin of cultivated plants, a range of them, including rice, moth, bean, horse gram, eggplant, rat-tail radish, mango, hemp, pepper, indigo, and so on. Several economic plants, such as the banana and rice, had been domesticated concurrently in Southeast Asia, where several species had been recorded. Incidentally, to pursue her interest in the origins of the banana, she got herself the book by Cherry and Jacob called Wild Bananas, published 1952, in which the wild banana, with its stony fruit, must have attracted, as it still attracts, primitive tribes, she observed. The wild banana had evolved into cultivated forms through the accidental outcome of sterile forms, produced either by hybridity or by triploidy, natural hybridization. The wild tribes would instantly notice the stoneless banana varieties, that is, the stoneless ones are the sterile bananas, the triploid ones. Wherever they occurred, the tribes would collect these and grow them near their huts. She also stated that with every one of the major food crops cultivated in the world, wheat, rice, and maize, there was one of great local or regional importance, such as the coconut palm in combination with rice on the west coast of India, used as food, timber, and thatching. All parts of Caryota urine, so the toddy palm, for example, were used by tribal communities such as the Paniers of Wayanad as food, the pith of the palm being full of starch, used as famine food. As building material, leaves were used as thatching in ceremonies and in making their digging sticks using the outer rind of the palm. She also cited the example of palms such as the borassus, the wild date, Phoenix sylvestris, and the Cycas circinalis, which played important roles in the subsistence economy of the tribal people of the Western Ghats. While you have the analogous tree, the useful tree in peninsular India being the mahua, or the Maduka latifolia. Unfortunately, environmental historians have completely overlooked the pioneering contributions of this Indian woman scientist to ecological thinking. One of the aims of the Central Botanical Laboratory of the BSI, of which Janaki Ammal was director, was the search for new economic plants such as those cultivated by indigenous tribes, but had not included in its scope the nature at that point, had not included the mapping of agricultural practices or farming practices. But what the Wenner-Gren Symposium did for Janaki was to sharpen her awareness of folk agricultural practices in India and make her politically alert to the power of market economies to destroy the environment. She had already a glimpse of this loot, the plunder of precious resources, when she was the director of agriculture in charge of the Grow More Food campaign in the 1940s. Henceforth, her focus after the Wenner-Gren Symposium would not be limited to the cytogenetics of cultivated plants, their breeding in controlled environments, or even the study of primitive cultivars, but broadened to include a study of the origin and dispersal of agricultural practices. So what the Galapagos Islands were to Darwin, in a way the Western Ghats was to Janaki. So there was immediately after the Wenner-Gren, there was this Kandy Symposium convened by UNESCO. It was a landmark environmental conference again, and Janaki figured in it prominently. The eighth session, it was, of the General Conference of the UNESCO, in 1954, had taken this decision to promote the coordination of research on scientific problems relating inter alia to the humid tropical zone, and to promote international or regional measures to expand such research. As a consequence of this, a symposium titled Study of Tropical Vegetation was jointly organized at Kandy in 1956 by UNESCO. UNESCO's science cooperation offices in South Asia, there's Delhi and Jakarta, in collaboration with the National Commission of Ceylon for UNESCO. So in all, you had some 26 specialists from across the world. And Janaki again was the sole woman delegate at the symposium. And her symposium this time was titled, her symposium paper was titled, An Introduction to the Genetical Analysis of the Humid Forest Flora of South Asia. And it fell into the special papers category, where themes were chosen by the authors themselves. Janaki's paper was in a way a response to the conclusions of the Fourth World Forestry Congress, which was held at Dehradun in December 1954, wherein the future policy with respect to the conservation of natural resources, in particular forests, was discussed. The summary report of which was published in the Indian Forester. At this meeting, resolutions on conservation, that is the Forest Conference, forest management and education, and a system of classifying forest land had also been passed. Janaki's major critique of the policy was that, but for suggesting the use of improved strains by selection in breeding, there was no emphasis on the study of forest flora from a genetic or an evolutionary perspective. Janaki observed that the studies of rainforests in South Asia were being led to a good extent by what she would say principles and policies relevant really to the temperate regions of the world, where the flora that is coming together of individual species exhibited far less diversity in the temperate world than in the tropics. In fact, foresters in Assam were promoting a plantation approach to cultivation by conscientiously doing away with mixed cropping that was so natural to the region, instead of learning to perfect technique of coexistence of different species, which is normal for the type of forests in Assam. So she cited a paper by the Assam forester P.D. Tracy, which was published in the Indian Forester in this regard. These reasons actually drove Janaki to choose as her topic for the Kandy Symposium a critical study of the genetical analysis of the flora of South Asia, clearly revealing once again her archipelagic and biogeographical thinking. The flora of South Asia, she observed, was really, she would look beyond national boundaries. She would say that the flora of South Asia was really part of the great Indo-Malaysian rainforests, which extended from Ceylon and Western India, Assam, Burma to Thailand, Indochina, the Philippines, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo to New Guinea. All of the humid forests of the tropics. Her paper was a plea for the consideration of humid forest studies as a special discipline, important not only for an understanding of the origin and evolution of tropical forests, but also for their future development and management. She argued for a gene ecology of forest flora, which was a nod really to the Swedish botanist, a forest biologist, Gautier Turesson, who made a distinction between the study of species ecology and the ecology of an individual organism. A quintessential border practice, gene ecology was a synthesis of the genetical, ecological, and taxonomical approaches in which a species was understood as a genetically complex community, the distribution and the composition of which is largely determined by the ecological factors and the genotypical constitution of the individuals composing the species community. You can ignore that for the moment. Flora was far more than a coming together of individual species. It was an association deeply rooted in the physiology and soil requirements of the plants. They not only influenced the place they inhabited, but also influenced each other. The association was also contingent on the migration of plants. Which in turn was determined by reproductive efficiency and adaptability to travel and withstand competition. Janaki argued that a study of the genetic composition of a given flora would not only shed light on all these characteristics, but it will be able to explain diversity in plants. An analysis of a mixed forest becomes even more significant when the plants composing an association are analyzed cytologically, analyzed from the point of view of chromosomes. The present flora of South and Southeast tropical Asia, she said, is therefore worthy of closer examination to study the processes whereby species, genera, and families have changed in the course of age. The aim of taxonomy, this was very important to her, she reiterated, was to unravel the evolution of the true race history of plants in the Darwinian sense, beginning with the primitive and moving on to the more developed. A species, in other words, was not to her to be treated as a fixed entity. It was always transitional. Janaki was dismayed to see several systematic botanists still resorting only to morphological characters to distinguish between species, even a century after the origin of species had been published. She stated, as the carriers of genes, the chromosomes, marked many of the steps by which species, genera, and even families have diverged, and argued that an increase in the knowledge of chromosome numbers of tropical forest trees would not only help map the extent of diploidy, which is the lower level of evolution in the evergreen forest flora, but it would also throw up useful information on the chromosomal relationship between different families of woody plants that make up tropical forest flora. She observed that in the associations that you see in humid forests, for instance, in the Western Ghats, there was a conspicuous gradation in the families that compose the different tiers of the flora. So in evolutionary terms, the highest canopy comprised of the primitive genera, while the middle tier, chiefly of climbers and lioness, assumed an intermediary position on the evolutionary scale, and the bottommost tier of such plants as the strobilanthes, the Neelakurinji, if you've heard of the Neelakurinji, of the Nilgiris, were the most evolved among those belonging to the family, the Gametopetalae. Humid forests had at one time, according to her, been great centers of speciation by hybridization, but they had now become somewhat static, with a population comprised of secondary diploids. So drastic climate changes caused by the genesis of the Indian Ocean and the resultant southwest monsoon had given rise to extraordinary climatic variations, she observed, which in turn had led to discontinuity in the distribution of humid forest types in India. So to her, it was worth probing how the present, in fact, it's worth probing how the present wave of drastic climate change is further influencing what Janaki had observed. She suggested that there was an affinity between the African forest flora and that of India by virtue of being connected to, in an earlier geological epoch, the Gondwana. Their breaking away from each other was more recent, she speculated, as several of the commonly found plants in Western India were also found in Africa, especially Madagascar. But despite the interesting scenario, hardly any cytogenetical work on a comparative scale had yet been undertaken. So she pointed out that very little cytological research had been done on humid tropical flora, and the little work she had done revealed that the large trees that composed the upper canopy of the humid forest were the primitive types. So it was immediately followed by the Kandy, it's called, I just distinguished them by calling it the Kandy Symposium and the Kandy Meeting, which happened in 1956. And there was also one more in 1958. It was on conservation. So as the Kandy Museum came to a close, the UNESCO Director General called for a preparatory meeting of experts on the humid tropics, and it was held between the 22nd and 24th March 1956, which included Janaki Ammal. Again, the only woman delegate. The aim of this Kandy meeting was to consider matters pertaining to research in the fundamental aspects of the natural sciences of interest in humid tropical zones. To stimulate the carrying on of such research, to assist it, and in cases where important problems are not at present receiving adequate attention, to initiate or promote the necessary research. This meeting took place also in Kandy, and the papers were published by UNESCO in a volume titled Problems of Humid Tropical Regions. It was published in 1958. Janaki's focus on this occasion was on the ecological conservation of forests in the humid tropics. She was easily the first Asian scientist to think along these lines. Among the recommendations of the Kandy Symposium was the conducting of cytological surveys of the forest flora, so that the evolutionary tendencies may be brought to light. Further, alarmed by the fast disappearance of several types of tropical vegetation, it recommended that all governments of tropical countries undertake it as a matter of urgency, the formation of natural reserves, and the study of vegetation that was fast depleting or becoming extinct. Both these were Janaki's suggestions to UNESCO. At the Kandy meeting, Janaki's focus was again on the humid regions of South Asia, primarily the forests of the region, which included India, Pakistan, Burma, and Ceylon, and formed part of the great Indo-Malayan rainforest region, with the Western Ghats playing a central position. The growing pressure on the natural resources in the region and the demand to provide food to the teeming millions had depleted vast stretches of forest to make way for agriculture, and she'd noted this during the Grow More Food campaign, of which she was director, one of the directors. Janaki had, after all, been a direct witness, as I just said. She spoke of how it had caused incalculable damage to forests, particularly in the Western Ghats and Assam, the consequence of which were annual floods in the plains, including, we see this in our contemporary times. How prescient she was. Reflecting on economic and ecological history, Janaki stated that a just balance between land utilized for cash crops and internal consumption had to be arrived at, an aspect that had been ignored in the past years, driven by the needs of industry and export market. She was clearly driving home Sauer's point that the morality of capitalism was yet to distinguish between yield and loot. As a food gatherer, man was here part of the biotic community of forests, she stated. It is true that she always used the he as the pronoun, he digs for roots, but the damage done in humid, luxurious forests is not great. It is true he hunts, but he hunts for his living and not for export. It's only for subsistence. His family is small because he does not reproduce as prolifically as urban dwellers. The time of nursing being prolonged until children are able to digest roots and meat. Janaki argued that it was only when forest tribes took to cultivation that ecological balance began to be disturbed. It was to be controlled, uncontrolled shifting cultivation practices by certain forest tribes in Assam and the Irulas in the Western Ghats that she attributed the changeover from the climax. These were the deterrents to producing a stable community of vegetation. She also held responsible the selective harvesting of certain trees for food and the making of primitive tools, such as the caryota urens for extracting starch and making the digging stick, or the artocarpus hirsutus for making dugouts and canoes. She did not fail to query whether there were similarities in ways of life among tribes across, again archipelagic thinking, across the humid forests of the tropics that had missed the attention of anthropologists. Get the next. So any study investigating the ecology of human forests, Janaki argued, should also undertake a macro-level study of primitive man in humid forests and his relationships with the fauna and flora of tropical forests. According to her, man's role in changing the biotic composition of humid forests occurred through two groups of processes. The first group of processes, which she called the pioneer effect, comprised the changes brought about by man's exploitation of forest trees for timber, firewood, or charcoal, activities limited to the periphery of the forest rather than the inner forest region, and without any concern about their availability in the future. The second was the effect stemming from intensive land use by man, such as the establishment of plantations of rubber, tea, and coffee in the shola forests, or driving animals to graze inside forests as practiced in Malabar. Activities occurring in the inner forests, which led to deforestation and soil erosion. These activities brought about a shift in the species composition, both in number and quality, she noted. And more importantly, by breaking up the forest canopy, altered the microflora of the inner forests. She cited the example of pests like the lantana, which had the ability to take over cleared areas in forests and irrevocably change the very profile of a forest. The traditional practice of setting apart a section of the forest as sacred, as in Assam and Malabar, Janaki noted, contributed enormously to keeping vegetation unaltered. Referring specifically to Malabar, where the sacred groves called Kavagan, the Paramba form of cultivation demanded only a limited forest clearance, with useful trees in the clearing retained for timber, firewood, or as supports for pepper wine. The spaces between trees were also put to good use to grow crops such as ginger, turmeric, yams, bananas, and cassava. The garden vegetables were grown closer to the house and rice cultivated in the low-lying wetlands. This was exactly how her Paramba was. In fact, as I said, the Edam, which is what her house was called, the Edam Paramba was organized in this very manner. To her, Parambas were self-sustaining economic units, nearest to nature, she would say. And the fact that they had been present in the humid regions from very early times demonstrated their relevance and significance. The demand for cash crops such as rubber, tea, coffee, and bananas for the export market had given rise to the monocropping or plantation style of cultivation, which soon began to replace the Paramba-style mixed cropping cultivation. This shift had led to widespread destruction of useful trees and the consequent soil erosion on an unprecedented scale, as in the Anai Malays, where tapioca was cultivated on a plantation basis and potatoes and needles, causing soil erosion. So it altered the very landscapes of these regions. So discussing future plans for the study of humid forests of South Asia, Janaki stated categorically that it was the duty of every botanist to save all the plant species in their region from extinction without exception. She suggested that the practice of maintaining sacred groves could be undertaken on a scientific basis by creating sanctuaries or protected forests in different parts of South Asia. She stressed the need to evolve a consistent method for the study of humid forests across the region, much like how her friend Enel Bohr had suggested, and more importantly, the need to conduct cytological studies alongside systematic and ecological ones to map the genetic evolution of the floras of humid forests. She was particular that ecological studies should explore the interconnections between flora, fauna, and the forest dwellers. She suggested the founding of an international center for chromosome studies that would facilitate an exchange of slides, plant materials, and research findings, for the crucial study of the floras, the humid forests, but none of this was happened. She also suggested use of aerial photography and things like that. So it was only a logical progression that saw her take up a new project sometime in the 1970s, upon return to Madras, where her journey had all begun way back in the 1920s as a graduate student at the University of Madras. So the project that she had begun was coming up with a modern version of the 17th century herbal compendium. Several of you would have heard of the Hortus Malabaricus, the Dutch Hortus Malabaricus. Her interest in this Dutch collection arose chiefly out of her investigations in ethnobotany, or on the primitive cultivars of food and the economic and medicinal plants used by the Aborigine tribes of the Western Ghats. She not only wanted to rework the compendium in chromosomal terms, but also to decolonize it supplementing it with new plants and new knowledge collected directly from the forest dwellers. Coincidentally, many of you would have heard of Professor K.S., the late K.S. Manilal. He would also apply about the same time for a UGC grant to work on a translation and annotation of the Hortus Malabaricus, this great work was completed over several years and has been published by the Kerala University. So he translated from the original Latin to English. So Janaki's proposal to bring out an illustrated book on South Indian medicinal plants with special reference to ethnobotany was sanctioned in late 1977 by the Department of Science and Technology. It was to end in 1981, and she was already in her 80s at this time. If the original Hortus Malabaricus from the 1670s was based on information gathered through the brokers of knowledge, such as the Irava Itti Achudan and Konkani Brahmin physicians like the Ranga Bhatta and Vinayaka Bhatta and Apu Bhatta of Dutch Malabar or Fort Kochi area, the modern Hortus envisioned by Janaki 3 centuries later was an anti-colonial compendium of medicinal plants, the Western Ghats, chiefly Malabar, reordered from the chromosomal point of view, but based on information collected in situ from the forest dwellers, the tribals, who she believed were the primary interlocutors of indigenous medical knowledge, not these brokers of knowledge. Janaki had often spoken of the urgent need to record the knowledge of forest flora that had come down through generations of tribal people, which was in danger of being lost. This ethno-medical project was really a response to that. In a way, it was also a homage to her father's ancestors, the famed Orachari Gurunathan Mar of Talasheri, Malabar, well known as Sanskrit scholars, herbal healers, and astrologers. So in 1976, widespread protests erupted against the Silent Valley project, which I'm sure all of you know. The story of the protests and Save the Silent Valley campaign against the hydroelectric project have become something of a legend today, invoked every time a threat to biodiversity is perceived, but absent from the narrative is the name of Janaki Ammal. Her involvement with the campaign and the part she played in drumming up support against the project as a pioneering woman cytogeneticist and the only female presence on the Committee on Science and Technology, Government of Kerala, and the Government of India has hitherto gone unnoticed. My book is also an attempt to remedy this significant lacuna. In fact, we might weave the whole story around 3 women protagonists, each one pioneering in her own right. With her romantic take on nature and forest, the poet Sugata Kumari, through her scientific and gene ecological approach, the evolutionary biologist E.K. Janaki Ammal, and for her pivotal and brave role in eventually putting an end to the project by virtue of her political power, Mrs. Kandy. On 14th August 1977, Janaki sent the British cytogeneticist Darlington, who was a good friend of hers, she sent him a booklet on the Silent Valley, in which it said the Silent Valley is being sacrificed to provide the necessary power for Kerala. Perhaps this was that booklet she sent was perhaps the report of the task force for the ecological planning of the Western Ghats, headed by Futehalli, published 1977. I cannot confirm this, however. Janaki wanted the Silent Valley issue to become a global issue, with influential scientists on the international scene taking a stand and intervening on the issue, and for this purpose appealed to Darlington, who had the reputation to be loud and hard-hitting when it came to issues of this nature. Janaki wrote to him, I did my best to save the Silent Valley at a meeting of the Science and Technology Group of the International Science Academy, of which I am a member. Please do what is in your power to help. Save this most ancient relic of evergreen forest in India, if not the world. She wanted the issue to attract global attention. In 2 weeks, Janaki would make a dramatic announcement to Darlington. Dear Cyril, I'm about to start a daring feat. I have made up my mind to make a chromosome survey of the forest trees of the Silent Valley, which is about to be made into a lake by letting in the waters of the river Kunti. I was trying hard, as were some others, to save the valley and its ancient flora, but big business in Kerala is, I think, going to have its own way. The forest department would, however, not give her access to the area for study. On 28 July 1979, Charan Singh had replaced Morarji Desai as Prime Minister. He received a confidential report from the National Committee on Environmental Planning and Cooperation, which stated that it did not recommend the project and was of a strong opinion that the Silent Valley should be preserved as a whole, for it was indeed a precious reservoir of genetic diversity which had not been fully explored. It's one of those species-rich areas where little-known plants and other forms of life have survived for centuries in the wild. It is to gene pools like this that man will have to return to in the future to find new materials for agriculture, for the life-saving drugs and the many other needs which will arise. The influence of Janaki in preparing this report is unmistakable, because the concern for genetic diversity was at the very core of her scientific practice, much more than any of her Indian contemporaries at this time. Janaki hailed M.S. Swaminathan's intervention in the matter and made clear her intention of conducting a cytogenetic survey of the valley's flora. I'm very happy that you are taking action to preserve the flora of the Silent Valley, he wrote. I have sent a scheme for financial assistance to Dr. B.P. Pal, Benjamin Pyare Pal, from the Man and Biosphere Committee of the Department of Science and Technology. The proposed project is entitled Cytogenetic Survey of the Flora of the Silent Valley. She had turned 82 only 3 months earlier. Her intention of doing such a survey, we may recall, had already been communicated to Darlington. The Palghat Gap in the Western Ghats, the Nilgiri Plateau, the very heavy rainfall in the valley, its impenetrable nature, and its continuous history of several million years of evolution has considerably influenced rich vegetation. It is perhaps the last remains of the evergreen biota of the tropics, Janaki wrote in her proposal. This project would be sanctioned and was to begin on the 22nd October 1980, and the Silent Valley controversy would remain one of his Janaki's greatest concerns during this period. Meanwhile, on the 12th January 1918, Indira Gandhi, who had been swept back to power in the general elections earlier that month, had visited Kerala to campaign for the state assembly elections. When asked by the press reporters about the Silent Valley issue, Mrs. Gandhi stated in no unclear terms that while all must be done to improve the power situation in the state, the world is getting more and more conscious that all such developments should keep in view ecosystem or ecology, because destroying or disturbing it will leave long-term adverse effects. It's worthwhile to see whether we can get some benefits without destroying these forests, is what she said. By mid-July, Mrs. Gandhi had written a third letter to Kerala Chief Minister E.K. Nayanar with regard to the Silent Valley project, saying that while she appreciated the reasons for his anxiety to see the hydroelectric project through, it was important to do what was necessary to protect the environment. She was convinced of this from the preliminary scientific reports that had reached her from scientists of the BSI, the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleontology, the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources, Lucknow, and the Center for Advanced Studies in Botany, and the University Botanical Laboratory, Madras, the last two chiefly represented by Janaki. Mrs. Gandhi concluded that from the point of view of ecology and importance of biosphere reserves, it would not be desirable to approve the Silent Valley hydroelectric project. In fact, she made it clear that she would like him to begin work on the development of the Silent Valley National Park without further delay. Eventually, on 26 November 1980, the Kerala government declared the Silent Valley a national park. We know this. In conclusion, we might state that rather than expend energy fighting the Kerala government over the Silent Valley issue, Janaki chose the path of least resistance, as it were. She creatively instead floated the idea of undertaking a pioneering project on the cytogenetics of the flora of these undisturbed forests. The Silent Valley issue would only reaffirm her inviolable belief in the ecological values of biodiversity and the conservation of genetic resources. She was one of the earliest to speak about genetic erosion, and this is way back in the 1930s, but you have Otto Frankel and Erna Bennett, who actually coins the term genetic resource. It is only in the 60s that they actually think of genes as a resource. But she'd already stated this while she was at the sugarcane breeding station in Coimbatore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have been to Silent Valley. I have seen live how the ecosystem is vibrantly alive. It is only one of the ecosystems that is the way exactly how the nature has designed. The flora, the fauna, the Kundi River, the major tributary of Bharatapuzha,
Yes.
and Bhavani River, tributary of Kaveri.
Yeah.
They originate here, and the ecosystem is completely preserved just because of one woman. They said it. They themselves explained there itself. And
When?
just 2-3 years back, I've been visiting many times.
So they mentioned?
Yes.
That's
They said
interesting.
that because it receives copious rainfall, something like 11,000 mm.
Right.
India, the average rainfall is 1,100 mm, 1100 mm.
Right.
Silent Valley ecosystem receives 11,000, 10 times the national average.
I see.
So it is having copious water.
Right.
Because there is no, as such, there is no Bharatapuzha, there is no just irrigation. It is only power generation is possible.
Yes.
Only because the whole country is going towards capitalism.
Right.
The man assumes that resources are for man's consumption and exploitation.
Right.
But the truth is that man himself is sustained because of ecosystem. It is reverse.
Absolutely.
Man's approach is diametrically opposite to what the nature has designed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The one question I want to ask
Sure.
is, the man-induced polyploidy to induce genetic mutation for to meet the shortage of grains and food for
Yes.
the growing population explosion. But the nature has sustained for millions of years without change, statically. Means it is not going for mutation or genetics.
You can have natural mutations.
Man is doing polyploidy. Is it sustainable? Is it sustainable on one basis? Man does it because he wants it for the population growth. Needs more food and more. So mutation is necessary.
Yeah, it's not just for food.
The man thinks the brain itself is the design of the nature.
Yes.
So how nature designed human brain thinks against the very nature so where is the break point?
It's really not a question for me to answer because I am not a scientist in the first place. The other is I'm speaking about something in history, right? And what I can tell you about polyploidy, whatever little I know, whatever I've understood, and what I've tried to articulate in this book, polyploidy happens naturally. It also happens, you can induce it, and which is something that Janaki was involved with. And now this happens, it depends on the kind of plant families we're speaking of. Now, when she was in London, she was with the Royal Horticultural Society's gardens at a place called Wisley. So it's an RHS gardens, and mainly it is all about ornamentals. Now, the people there are, as connoisseurs of various plant families. There are, magnolia connoisseurs, there are camellia connoisseurs, rhododendrons, and they grow these things. They grow every variety of these. They're collectors. So there are what are called these very elite, gentlemanly horticulturalists. Now, when she was working there as a geneticist, she was very disillusioned after a few years, although she was the first salaried woman scientist of this institution, the RHS. She ended up purely becoming some kind of a chromosome counter Because you had these gentlemanly horticulturists bringing plants to her and asking her to distinguish one variety from the other, and even to find out if it really was a different species, for instance. Now, when you induce polyploidy, as she was trying to do, she conducted several experiments in polyploidy on various ornamental flowers, families of flowers, so of flowering plants. All of that is when you increase polyploidy, you get bigger flowers. For instance, you get bigger pumpkins. You might get a seedless watermelon, as Idstead did. So these are all the needs, the uses of doing, of actually what is triggering polyploidy through the use of a chemical like colchicine. Much less X-rays. X-rays was used in rice and stuff like that. So it's a very different nature of triggering mutations to create polyploidal plants. Now, polyploidy has also been used, for instance, in the breeding stations, such as the sugarcane breeding station, in order to understand, in order to create perhaps an early cane, a disease-resistant cane. There are various needs where you actually create a hybrid by inducing artificially mutation in order to produce a cane which can flower early, which has the highest sucrose content, which perhaps doesn't grow too tall, various characters. So you go through, a selection, you make a selection, and you create some kind of an economic cane, right? So polyploidy as a tool is used in these ways. But later on, what she's trying to use polyploidy, and she is very interested in the understanding the centers of diversity rather than centers of origin, which is what Nikolai Vavilov was speaking about, centers of origin of cultivated plants, because you can't have one origin. There were multiple origins. So it was better that the scientists began to use a different term. They said we must think of something like centers of diversity, from where things could have circulated, several centers of diversity. So when she studied the magnolia, which is one of the earliest, it's a prehistoric plant, we are trying to map how the diploid magnolia in one geography becomes a polyploid magnolia, say in Yunnan, for instance. You have a very different cartography that can be drawn. And you can understand evolution, because evolution is always from a diploid to a polyploid, right? And this happens in nature too. And her interest was in mapping how plants traveled in the footsteps of man. As man has migrated, so has man taken with him or her grains, grasses, weeds. You take pathogens, you take everything, isn't it? So, which is why, you use this. Edgar Anderson has this wonderful title to his book called Man and His Transported Landscapes. So, polyploidy is, for her, a way of tracking evolution. Is what that's all the answer I can give you, yeah?
You mentioned there was a book that she was going to write in 1976 on the modern anti-colonial Hortus Malabaricus.
Yes.
Could you expand a little bit on that? Because that was written, as you mentioned, in the 1700s.
Yes.
So what was her take on?
Yeah. So if you have some sense of the 17th century, 1670s onwards, in multiple volumes, the Dutch compendia of what's called a Dutch herbal of plants from Malabar. Malabar is a very extended area, actually. So what you have is really a collection of plants put together commissioned by this Dutch commander called Van Reed. So he uses certain people, like I said, the Irawa healer or a herbal, the Irawa herbsman, or what can we call him a Vaidyan as they were called. You also had the They were also Sanskrit scholars. So they were, I am calling them brokers of knowledge. They were not the original interlocutors of knowledge, yeah? So they know it through their practice of medicine. They know these plants that way. These plants are brought from the forests. So they are actually not the original interlocutors of how these plants are useful as food and medicine. So what Janaki is trying to do is she is trying to go to the primary interlocutors who are the forest dwellers. They use these plants. It's only after they are the ones who actually know about the medicinal qualities of these plants and how some of those tubers and some of those plants can be used as food. This knowledge travels to more of these civilized spaces, and that is where the Dutch commander is sitting with his group of these brokers of knowledge. So they are the intermediaries. They're not the primary interlocutors. So what Janaki is trying to do is she's actually visiting the forest, collecting these very same plants. Some of them, of course, are trees because the Hortus Malabaricus, if you're familiar with it, it starts with the coconut palms, right? And most herbals from this area, from the South Asian area, if you've studied 2 or 3 other herbals, I don't know whether you're familiar with other herbals, they all begin with the coconut palm, which is the most useful one, and it makes sense to one. It makes great sense to one because of the great use of the coconut palm. So you have several other plants in the Hortus, which are of course not great trees, but they are medicinal plants. So Janaki actually goes looking for these plants, their wild relatives in these forests. Now these are collected and she will do a chromosomal analysis of this. The Dutch compendium does not, of course, do any of this. It has a certain kind of taxonomy, starting with the coconut palm. It's pre-Linnaean. There is no such order that is maintained. It's purely on the basis of big trees, shrubs, herbs, and so on. And even there's a lot that's missing. So what she's doing is she goes to these pioneers and several other people who live there. She gets first-hand knowledge of how they use these plants, how they actually domesticate them, including, we said, the wild bananas, for instance. So all of these things are collected in the first place, and you have a herbarium, but you also do a chromosomal analysis. You also experimentally breed them, which was what she was doing in the Mother of Wild Gardens that, where she was staying, the Mother of Wild Agricultural Field Station of the University of Madras, the Center for Advanced Studies in Botany. So you're doing a new Hortus Malabaricus, which was based on chromosomal arrangement. On a chromosomal basis, the whole thing was being reordered, rather than in the manner of just trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbs and stuff like that, which is the usual way herbals of that time are ordered. It's not just this, but I happened to rediscover a herbal called the Gurney herbal, which I call it the Gurney herbal, at the British Library, London, which actually predates the Hortus Malabaricus, postdates Gashadotter's colloquies. Again, you will find these palms there. It starts off with big trees. So a new Hortus, a modern, and when I say decolonial, is to decolonize, is to not, this is a Dutch compendium again. It depends on what they wanted and what they thought was economically useful to them. But the one that she's doing, collecting information from the primary interlocutors of this knowledge, this plant knowledge, which is the forest dweller for Janaki, and doing a chromosomal analysis and reorder this whole thing based on chromosome numbers, which is it wasn't a project that she really completes, which in fact should be done actually. Someone should take it up.
Hi. You mentioned how in a work it was important to understand the quote-unquote agricultural soul of a place. What are the methodology in which she employed? what was the methodology in which he kind of
Yeah.
went on about
So,
that?
first of
And-
all, the agricultural soul of the place is actually Vavilov's phrase, and Vavilov gives you a very clear description of what he means by figuring out the agricultural soul of the place. That is to actually go to a place, which is what he was doing. I don't know if you're familiar with Nikolai Vavilov. So Nikolai Vavilov was a Russian. He was, there is something called the Lysenko affair, where this is during Stalin's regime. So where classical genetics was debunked, they did not think genes had any role to play, etc. So everything was environmental determinism was the rule of the day, and that was represented by Trofim Lysenko. And then you have Vavilov is sent to the Gulag in the 1945, and he perishes. And he sets up this Institute of Plant Industry where he collected grains from across the world. Of course, he also wanted to come to visit India, but he wasn't allowed to enter. He wasn't given permission to enter. But he did regard India as one of the centers of origin of certain cultivated plants, a major center. Now, what Janaki is actually saying is she's just, and Vavilov was Janaki's muse. She wanted to go to Russia to study. She wanted to go and work with Vavilov. So she has a very, very, very strong emotional, intellectual connection with Vavilov. So Vavilov, when he in his reports of various expeditions that he took up from the late 1910s to about the 1930s, were all about finding the agricultural soul of the place, trying to find out what plants people used, what they grew, how they cultivated, every little thing. How did they cook food? What did they eat? What did they do to keep themselves warm? What were the trees that were growing? What is the firewood they were using? What were the grains that they were storing, for instance? So many of these, every aspect of a plant. How did they preserve something? All of this. So it wasn't simply to go traverse these landscapes and just, observe, say, pick up a few things and go back and keep it in his Institute of Plant Industry, but actually immerse himself there and do a kind of ethnography of these practices, of everyday life, of farming practices. So many of these things. Look at the wild relatives of some of them that are growing there. So it was a huge, very extensive and intensive mapping of a zone or of a village or whatever it is that he's doing.
Evening, but I really want to thank you, Preeta, for your work and your talk, and I'd like you all to join me in giving Preeta a big hand.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for your patience.